Welcome back to Better Than Before. I'm your host, Tony Richards, and today we're going to talk about core-centered leadership, and my friend Carolina Caro is our special guest. She's a keynote speaker, a certified leadership coach, and professional facilitator. She specializes in mindfulness-based practices rooted in neuroscience, which we talk a lot about here on this program. She enhances awareness so that leaders can uncover their blind spots and consciously develop behaviors that cultivate their leadership potential. She partners with organizations to empower leaders to master their minds so that their minds don't master them. She trained with IPEC, which is the Institute for Professional Excellence in Coaching, and is a member of the ICF, International Coaching Federation, where she maintains her credentials, PCC, and she's also an established speaker who's earned her designation as a professional member of the National Speakers Association. She was recently invited to join the Forbes Coaches Council, where she contributes articles and participates on their expert panels. Now, here's the most interesting paragraph in her bio. She's a passionate advocate for diversity, which has shaped every aspect of her life. She's a Montreal native with both Hispanic and Indian roots, fluent in English, Spanish, and French. Her educational background is just as rich and diverse, with an undergrad in cell and molecular biology, a master's degree in science of experimental medicine, a master's degree in business administration, a professional certificate in acting from the Neighborhood Playhouse School of Theater in New York. Her career has taken her from medical research laboratories studying HIV and AIDS and advances in radiation oncology to sales and brand management positions for top Fortune 100 companies, to an array of artistic accomplishments as a member for the Screen Actors Guild, American Federation of Television and Radio Artists. She now lives in Pasadena, and she's honored to play a role in developing community leaders as the leadership coach and facilitator for Leadership Pasadena. She also takes pride in serving the Healthcare Businesswoman Association, a nonprofit organization dedicated to the advancement of women in healthcare with a mission to establish gender parity. And as I ask everyone who comes on this show, how in the world do you have time for me? My goodness, you're busy.
Everyone is these days, but we prioritize. It's all about priorities. And today you're my priority. So thank you for having me on.
You know just what to say. Carolina, thanks so much for doing this. I mean, I really appreciate you being on with us.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
So out of all these things, I mean, my goodness, what an interesting bio. Out of all these things, how'd you get to doing the work you're doing now?
Yeah, so it's interesting because when you're reading my bio, there's so much behind the story of how all these different career paths sort of came together. And for me, I came from a family that wasn't educated. My parents, I'm, first generation. They came from Venezuela with grade school education, didn't even speak English when they arrived. And one thing that they drilled in my head was the importance of education. And I took that very, very seriously. They also said to me, I don't know who else grew up with parents saying that there were three career paths. You could either be a doctor, a lawyer, or an engineer. So I went down the path of studying medicine, again, because this was sort of ingrained that this was the path I was supposed to be on. And at one point when I was working in the pharmaceutical industry, and I'm sure many people can resonate with working long hours, overworked, I was a bit of a workaholic, very stressed out. And my manager came to me at one point and said that I needed to get a hobby or something to start leaving the office at a reasonable hour, because I was setting a bad example for my team. And we had just established work-life balance as a value for our company, culture. And as a manager, I wasn't setting the right example. And this was something that at the time, this is me almost 15 years ago, I was pissed off when I heard that, because I was like, what are they talking about? This is the same person that they've been promoting, over and over for being a workhorse. Now all of a sudden, go get a hobby. What is that? And interestingly, how life happened, the hobby that I ended up getting was taking acting classes, just because I had no idea what to take. And my brother's like, oh, speak to a friend of mine. Why don't you take some acting? It'll help you for speaking, doing presentations, all this stuff. And that was life changing for me, because that's where I discovered mindfulness and being present in the moment. And it changed my life to such an extent that I quit my job. I moved from Montreal to New York, and that's when I started studying acting. But really, what I was pursuing was I wanted more of this mindfulness stuff. So that's how it began.
I'm just kind of curious, but your parents, Hispanic and Indian, and they
Yes.
chose to move to Canada. So do you know
Yes.
why they chose Canada?
Well, at the time we did have some family there, and in terms of immigration, they just thought that it would be the easier road versus coming to the U.S. And they had the dream, the dream of having a better life. They came from Venezuela, so Venezuela, as many people know, it's a corrupt political system. There's a lot of it's dangerous, and they just didn't want my brother and I growing up in that environment. So that's why they saw Canada as safe. You could have education, healthcare. So yeah, so that's their start of their story, and how I was born and raised in Montreal.
My wife grew up in North Dakota, and the first winter that I went there to visit, I asked her family, I'm like, your ancestors, when they had a winter in North Dakota, did they not think about moving on? And and she said, well, we came from Norway, so North Dakota is kind of tropical to us. So
Yeah.
it's always interesting to me why people choose to live, where they live. So let's move on to core centered leadership. So tell me a little bit about this concept you devised.
Yeah, so for me, I became a coach. So, I left acting, and that sort of opened up the opportunity of, what did I really want to do, where I started asking myself these important questions of how did I want to be of service? What did I really come here to do? What's my purpose? Sort of these kind of big existential questions. And that led me to coaching. And after several years of coaching, I started realizing that there were some similarities to all the clients that I was attracting. And the same thing went for my story. So there was a lot of similarities between what I experienced leaving my job, trying to find meaning in my work, some of the disengagement that I was seeing with a lot of my corporate clients, everything that was going on. I'm like, okay, there's a connection here, and why I was so attracted to mindfulness and how that was life changing for me, and the meaning that I feel that so many of us search for. And so that led to the creation of the 5C model, or core centered leadership. So the first piece is the connecting piece. And that's really the part where I recognize when we're not grounded, when we don't have a practice that allows us to get silent, to get centered, to get focused, to really open ourselves up to what I like to call our higher self, or that voice of intuition, that all-knowing voice, then that's where we get swayed into sort of following everyone else's idea of what success is, or the path that we might follow. And I think that's why I see so much, not only disengagement, but the anxiety that people feel, the disconnection that we feel. So there were all these patterns that led me to observe that this was really the first step to what I think being able to then be a good leader. If we can't connect to ourselves and to that deeper part of ourselves, then I don't think that we can be available for others. So that was the first.
Do you find that people do they tend to resist wanting to start with themselves first?
Yes, absolutely. I think there's been a lot of resistance. I mean, even when I first started, mindfulness was a concept that good luck trying to sell that to corporations, and I think we've come a long way in terms of understanding that, we talk about disengagement and the fact that it's costing the US billions of dollars and all of these things, all the Gallup studies and what have you, but we're not really looking at the underlying cause. And so I feel that we've come a long way, and now we're starting to look at these things. And that's where now there's a bit of a shift and an opening for people to say, okay, so when you're a better leader, by looking at yourself introspectively, then you're going to be better at how you show up at your job. My clients are tired of hearing me say, how you do anything is how you do everything.
Oh, so true.
Yeah, and so we need, and when I say we, I'm saying also corporations, companies need to invest in their employees in that way for them to also be able to get the most out of their employees. And when I say get the most out, I'm saying being able for their employees to show up with their strengths, their gifts, their engagement to work every day.
I have, I created a model called the galaxy of you, where you're in the center of your galaxy. And my first book was around that framework. And I've learned and I've experienced in my coaching life, so many people resist starting with themselves. They want to put this person first, or they want to put that person first, or whatever. And I constantly say, no, we have to put you first. And the reason is because you can continue to say you have to put all these other people in your life first while you're slowly but surely deteriorating, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we're trained to look at life that way in the sense of everything comes externally, right? How we're usually motivated and how, our perception of what success is, our ideas about ourselves, everything is so external that going internal, going within is such a foreign concept and not one that we've been trained to do.
So the second C is clarity. Tell me a little about that one.
Yeah, so that is born out of being able to be grounded and centered and focused. So when we are able to do that, then I think our why, if you will, and that's the part that I talk about, the clarity is understanding our purpose. And I think we're all here to connect with that part of ourselves, but then how we express it is different for all of us. And a lot of the clues are in some of the talents that we might display. And so the things that some of us resonate with, and we're all different in what attracts us. So some of us are artists and business people and whatever the case might be. So I think that clarity comes out of being able to listen and being able to be connected. So that's why it follows the connection piece. And for me, that was where I finally was able to disconnect from, okay, this path that was, laid out for me, this idea of going and becoming a doctor and studying medicine and all of that. When I was really able to tune in with myself, that's not at all what I feel that I came here to do. And a lot of times ideas are ingrained in us that come from those who, want us to have safety and security and, our parents, our teachers, what have you. So when we can listen to that inner voice, we have clarity about our why.
Another thing that I think is a little bit defective, and parents are just trying to do the best they can, right?
Absolutely.
But with they don't realize, and I don't care what stage you're in or what age you are as a parent, you're still trying to prepare your children for the world you currently know, not the world they're going to live in.
That's a great point.
Right.
Great.
So your process is doing a great service to people because they're discovering the world that they're supposed to live in now and their part to play in it, right?
Absolutely. That's a great point. And, I never looked at it that way. But as you're saying that, I think about my parents and instilling that, need for the career, the education that they did not have. And
Right.
their circumstances were not the circumstance because of their sacrifice and effort, were not the circumstances that I lived through. And I had so many more opportunities and choices, and really the privilege of asking myself these existential questions that they did not, because it was just work, work, work for them.
So the third step in core centered leadership is probably my favorite, creating a clear vision.
Right. So after obviously having that clarity of why we're here, I think that's when we can then develop being very intentional. So that's what I mean about having the vision. And I think that comes from, again, sort of it's inspiration that comes to us about how to act. So it's putting that into place so that we can take forward movement on our action. And I talk about intentionality because I mean, I think it's such an important word because Otherwise, we're really living by what I call default, which is sort of all these preconceived ideas that have been ingrained in us from a very young age, that are sort of our wiring, if you will, and the programming. And we live out that programming. And that's what I see with so many of my clients. I saw that in myself, that I was just living out sort of by default what I've learned. And when we can start being very intentional and asking ourselves questions and being able to put a very clear plan in place that comes from this inspiration, then I think we're limitless in terms of our possibilities.
So then you go to clearing behavioral patterns that corrode potential.
Yeah, so this is probably one of the most important steps in being able to, have that success piece that comes from creating the vision. And this is where I start to see what's keeping people in the way of being able to achieve what it is that they want. And this is probably why most of my clients come to me. So a lot of them might be able to do some of the other steps where they're getting clear on what they want. They've put an action plan or a strategic plan or what have you. And then we start finding out that there's underlying blocks that keep us from having what we want. And so there's different ways of looking at those blocks, there's different ways of clearing those blocks, but that's what then allows people to actually have what they've created in the previous step.
And then the final step is community-centric contributions to build collective well-being and promote equity.
This is key, and this is one that for me, I start asking myself these questions of, how do I want to be of service? When I left my career, I think that was the one question: what do I want to leave behind? And I think on a actual physiological level, we're programmed to help others. I mean, we get joy out of, we're connected, and when we do things that are greater than us and for that greater purpose, I think that just brings that inner joy. And community doesn't have to be global. It could be something very local. It could be your family, your friends. So what community means can be defined very differently for each of us. But when we're doing something that's, outside of ourselves and for others, I think that's where the true joy is.
So I was looking through your curriculum for core-centered leadership, and I saw some things that I mean, I really wanted to take the course, but I saw some things I wanted to ask you about, and one of them is in the introduction part of your course, and it says a little on hormones. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, so I talk about how, when we're under stress, particularly, because then I lead into being triggered and some of the things that happen to us physiologically that start at the level of the brain. And so, I talk a lot about the fact that we are wired for survival. We're not wired to thrive. And that comes from the fact that we have, from an evolutionary perspective, our brain, we have a lot of mechanisms that are there to protect us. And they made sense once upon a time in terms of, and they still do, obviously, from a survival perspective. And so what happens is we release a lot of different hormones that we need to be aware of, cortisol being one of them when we're stressed. And then there's oxytocin that allows us to bond with one another. It's what a mother releases when she has a baby. So when I help people understand that a lot of our behavior and the emotions that we feel are actually happening at the level first of our brain because we're releasing these hormones, when we can understand the basic physiology and how it relates to our emotions and how we can better almost manage them, that's where the emotional intelligence piece comes in, then that also leads to better leadership.
And then also because I've written pretty extensively on it because growing up in a really small town with rural parents who never really moved more than a mile away from where they were born and raised, they just couldn't help but have some fear passed on, and so I'm sort of an outlier in my family because I don't live around that geography. I moved 300, 400 miles away. But talk a little bit about how you deal with fear with your clients.
I think with each person, it's obviously it's very individualistic because as you said, somebody, for example, who's never moved, and that was the case for me once upon a time before moving then from Montreal to Toronto to New York to LA. But at the time, I'll take that as an example. Just the idea of not being within my 2 mile radius was extremely fearful. I even went to the same gas station. And I kid you not, I used the exact same gas station all the time to make sure that I knew the pump, that there were no surprises, like little things like that, or the same grocery store so I could find things on the aisle. So I use that as an example because the baseline for somebody like that, so me several years ago, would be different than me now in terms of what I'm afraid of today. And so it's being able to find how can I raise the ceiling, if you will, on what somebody is afraid of, right? Just moving the needle a little bit. So for somebody like me, it might be like, well, then let's try maybe going to a different gas station, or can we expand to maybe going to a different grocery store that's somewhere outside of your neighborhood just to see what that experience feels like. And understanding that something like that for a person might actually induce a lot of fear because of the unexpected or the unknown. And and when we move the needle, it's a matter of just continuously moving that needle and understanding that the fear is going to be there. It's just knowing that, okay, how do we deal with it and how do we prepare people for what they'll deal with? So if it's going into a grocery store and you don't know where anything is, well, how can we deal with the unknown in that case? And I don't like to prepare people for worst case scenarios because I think that we do a really good job of allowing our brain to ruminate on all these ideas. So in the preparation of the unknown, it's more of how to manage those emotions that are going to come up. And that's where the mindfulness piece comes in. When we can understand the things that trigger us and how to allow ourselves to get back into a state of calm, using anchors and so many other different tools, then I think we help people face the unknown in a way that is manageable.
And we all, as we grow as people, we have those experiences like first day in elementary school where we have the initial separation, maybe. And then we have the first day in high school. And then we have the first day at college where we're trying to find out where all of our classes are and where all the buildings are and the campus and all that. But some people learn from that and they normalize those experiences and even maybe get excited about the next one, while other people go through that same nervous fear of the new.
Absolutely.
Like you said, like you going to the same gas station help to normalize, and the thought of getting away from that routine was terrifying.
Exactly. And I think at the time, I didn't have the tools to move past that. So for me, it was almost these leaps that happen that sometimes were even sort of outside of my control, if you will, like moves that were almost forced upon me in order for me to be able to get to that next level. But that's not the best way to do it. I think the best way to do it is to have the tools that allow us to manage the emotions that come with that fear. And I think that's what allows people to get unstuck and to be able to move past the cycles. It's almost like grief, there's several stages that
Mm.
we move through. And in the same way with fear, when we can understand all the different versions of it that inflict us, and where that's coming from, not that we need to really understand it, but that it's coming from things that we experienced in our childhood so that we can then move through it. I think that makes it much easier for people to face those new situations.
I've been an admirer of your work, and I'm so glad we've got you on today because you're doing an excellent job of helping our audience understand core centered leadership. Last question for you on this topic. Talk a little bit about mindfulness and emotional intelligence. And you mentioned it a little bit before, but just kind of tie it all up here with some thoughts about mindfulness.
Sure. So Mindfulness for me became what changed my life when I was first introduced to this was the idea that I had no idea that I was never present in the moment. I didn't even know what being present in the moment was. And the interesting piece about where I was then is I actually mocked it. I mocked mindfulness, and I had a lot of judgment even about those people that would practice it. So kind of like this separation between myself and whatever mindful people was, because again, it was just creations that I had in my mind of what that meant. And once I discovered the power of it, so for me, what it means today is awareness of my feelings, awareness of my thoughts. Because again, if we live so much just either living in the past, living in the future, full of anxiety, particularly today, the pace at which we're living, I feel it's really unsustainable. And there's so much stress, there's so much anxiety. And when we're not able to be present, when we recognize that in the moment, there's actually uh, so much peace, so much happiness available to us, but that's not how we're used to living, and it's not how we've conditioned our mind to be. So when I extrapolate that to leadership, it's about teaching our leaders that they need to have those skills to have the self-awareness first in order to then move on to the emotional intelligence, other aspect of emotional intelligence, which is the management piece. So with the awareness then comes the management, not only of self but of others. And so that's really the root, I think, where all of it begins.
Carolina Caro. She is a leadership coach, keynote speaker, facilitator, and she has developed Core Center leadership model. Carolina, tell everybody how to find out more about you.
Well, they can reach me on my website by reaching carolinacaro.com, or they can actually text the word mindful to 345-345, and they can get on my newsletter.
Well, listen, I really appreciate you being on today.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the invite.
Receive weekly coaching tips from Tony Richards delivered straight to your inbox. Whether you're a CEO or an entrepreneur, Tony can help you reach your goals and give you a competitive edge within your industry. Tony's Monday morning coaching memo covers topics ranging from leadership development to teamwork to company culture and more. Text the word leadership to 38470 to sign up for Tony's Monday morning coaching memo, or sign up online at clearvisiondevelopment.com.